Noticed on TV, Donald Trump is now grabbing a lot of headlines, and the press is going after him with a vengeance. Historically, the left-wing press and the right-wing press, as we see in the Washington Post and the newspapers from Washington D.C. historically are pro-Zionist, right-wing newspapers, and we have this incredible situation where the New York Times and the Washington Post are quite a bit aligned together. I mean, how do you expect that to happen? The Washington Post, which has historically offered different opinions and views than the New York Times. And what has caused this? Can it be because Donald Trump went out there, especially to the Republican Jewish PAC committee, Public Action Committee, so-called donors, and told them, look, I don't need your money, I'm independent. And Rupert Murdoch and the owners of these newspapers have kind of gone after him. I mean, it all started when Trump basically took on the entire agenda. The immigration, open borders, Obamacare, black rights, and all these issues, the Muslims, that were the darling, apparently, of the U.S. newspapers, of the U.S. media. And all media have an agenda. I'm not going to argue that they shouldn't have an agenda, or you're in the business to publish, first of all, to make some money, and secondly, when you're doing well, then you start pushing your own agendas. And they've historically had Zionist agendas that has kept the American population quiet. And we saw the United States have overwhelming immigration last year, higher than any time before. New York City is pretty much overrun. There are a lot of restaurants, and I love to eat at these restaurants, but the seamy side are the chefs and all the garbage being scurried out by these little guys from Mexico. And you kind of wonder that, do you really want kind of a third world sweatshop in these restaurants and in their kitchens? Do you really want them sweating and kind of maintaining lower standards of hygiene than if they were all Americans and no illegals had to be hired in all the restaurants? And you had all the newspapers coming out the last time that the amnesty was declared. I don't even know when, but all the newspapers are like, okay, all the restaurants are going to shut down, and they threatened everybody with those kind of scenarios that, guess what, you guys are not going to get any food. It was ridiculous, but it kind of convinced the people, and the red states didn't really stand up. And I think it was only Obamacare that really galvanized the people, the red state Americans, really come out and to see Obama as a guy with an agenda, a liberal, radical, homosexual, socialist agenda. And I didn't agree particularly at that time when it all started, but the more I began to see what's really going on and what is Obamacare, and after visiting a few hospitals, unfortunately, that kind of opened up my eyes to the U.S. healthcare system. And you kind of realize that things are going south. And the people in the red states, I'd say, are like the bedrock, the people, the sons of the soil. You know, in Hebrew, the Israelis call them sabra. You know, the sons of the soil, born in Israel, and they're given a lot of value, and they're treated, you know, as the uber Israelis. And in America, however, it's a temporary country, you know, like a country that wasn't or isn't expected to have any form of nationalism or, you know, any point in being proud of America and the values, what it stands for. I mean, the guys who built the Empire State Building, the Hoover Dam, these guys weren't, you know, affirmative action Obamas, you know, coming out of Harvard and Princeton, poster boys for multiculturalism. No, these engineers and designers of the Hoover Dam and the Empire State Building were a hard capitalist, you know, of the Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt type that personified America in the 19th century when they tore apart New York, the Panama Canal, the gold rush, and all those days when a lot of things had to be done. And these were the guys that really built America. The California gold rush contributed to a lot of the gold of America, the Fort Knox, and the current value. And all these required blood and guts. A lot of Americans died in Nicaragua. A lot of Americans died in Panama trying to establish a water link between, you know, the eastern seaboard and the western seaboard, which was only possible through that narrow isthmus called the Panama Canal. And much has been written about the cruel Americans, but guess what? The entire future of America, the billions of dollars at that time, which is equivalent to trillions of dollars of today, were being ferried from the east to the west coast through the Panama Canal, through the Nicaragua Canal that was attempted, and it was the only way. I mean, we didn't have air travel at that time, and the only way to transfer gold bullion, I mean, back in the 19th century, we didn't have any of the fiat currency. It was all, you know, gold based, and gold had to be shifted. If you wanted to shift $1 billion from New York City to Los Angeles or San Francisco, guess what? It had to go through the Panama Canal. That's why the Panama region, the Panamanian region, and all of Central America became so important to America, North America. I'm not going to blame the Americans for trying to take control of that tiny isthmus and safeguarding their own interests of billions and trillions of dollars going through there. I mean, Panama and Nicaragua in the 19th century was a joke. It was a bunch of Spaniards from Europe, you know, who were in charge of these historically native Indian areas, and even till today from Mexico. Mexico to Argentina and Chile. It's all the Spanish Europeans that have a hegemony over much of South America and Central America. The so-called Spanish speakers have nothing to do with South America, the Indian heritage. I mean, they speak some Aztec language or Inca language, and Spanish is a European colonial language. So it's really laughable when Bush or any of these guys try to show solidarity with Spanish. Guys, it's European. It's still an imperial, so-called colonial language. And people kind of forget everything and try to argue on the most asinine, inane points without even having any clue what they're talking about. Now, one of the things that has grabbed headline news everywhere is Donald Trump saying that no more Muslims in America, no more new Muslim Americans or Muslim immigrants or Muslim visas. And it's kind of galvanized the world. A lot of the Arabs sat up for the first time in 1400 years and kind of took a look at themselves. Like, I guess you take a look at yourself in the mirror. Billions of Muslims who were sleepwalking like zombies through this life, hoping for the next life, the afterlife in, heaven, Jannat, and, these concepts, Hebrew concepts of Gehonim, Jahannam, hell and heaven that the Muslims have appropriated into their book. It's kind of what they're living for. I mean, the Jews have smartened up and given up on all that garbage a long time ago. But the Muslims have kind of not really had too much to think about. The Muslims pretty much believe in heaven and hell, and this life is temporary, and just get through it. There's no need to improve your lot. If you're suffering, then that's good because you're going to heaven. And if you blow up a few people who are against Islam, theoretically you die as a martyr, you're a shaheed, and you go to heaven anyway. So what's the big deal? And now comes Donald Trump, and he says, guess what, guys? This status quo is not happening anymore. We're stopping all you guys from coming in. You guys want to believe in heaven and hell and Allah and all that 1400-year-old stuff? Good. Keep it out of America. Stay out. And it's a harsh message. I'll agree with that. But I feel Donald Trump, as he says, that I have a lot of Muslim friends and they really agree with me. And that's a very interesting phrase, that he has a lot of Muslim friends who agree with him. And I guess those are the Muslims who are also aching for a reformation, a kind of a destruction of Islam from within. I mean, Martin Luther was a Christian, a monk, and he destroyed single-handedly Catholicism, led to the protest movement. Sure, millions died, and guess what? The Muslims are dying by the hundreds of thousands anyways, without a reformation. And that's the tragedy, that intellectually they die bereft of asking any metaphysical questions to themselves, that what were they really doing on this planet, and what really have they accomplished in 1400 years, apart from a brief glimmer, flash of brilliance in the Arabian Nights, Alif Layla Layla, which was the 1001 Arabian Nights. And that was cool. I mean, But guess what? That book is full of sex and girls and wine and fornication, and it was a time when Arabia was kind of free. It didn't have all these Sharia laws, amputation and eye for an eye garbage that you find in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these countries that want to set up a Sharia system. And you didn't have all that when the 1001 Arabian Nights were written, or when Rumi roamed West Asia, from Iran to Iraq to Syria and a host of other countries, and there was nobody to stop him from writing about women and wine, and nobody tried to execute him. And but then the people changed. The Mongol invasions destroyed a lot of the Muslim intelligentsia and the libraries of Baghdad. It used to be an intellectual fountainhead with mild application of Sharia, and it did encourage exegesis and kind of interpretation and all that. But meanwhile, the Christians came to the conclusion that, guess what? All this Old Testament, Middle Eastern God stuff was unnecessary. And Martin Luther and Friedrich the Great, they were trying to form the German nation, more importantly than a German role in the Holy Roman Empire. The Emperor Charles was considered a very enlightened man, but he was also head of the church, second only to the Pope, and Germany was a satrap, was a satrapy of Rome. And it was a time when the German nationalist movement started to coalesce around Martin Luther, and Friedrich the Great was able to transform allegiance to Rome to a German nation with German as the primary language rather than Latin as it used to be at that time. And the Germans were considered barbarians by the Romans, by the church, by the clergy. And it was a time when Mozart and everybody started coming out after that. Schopenhauer and Hegel, Schlegel, and all the musicians that we know, and the philosophers. So that's what we call the Renaissance. But guess what? It only came after Christianity was torn asunder by Martin Luther. And we need a movement like that in Islam. I mean, somebody needs to come and tear it from inside. An outsider can't really do it. Somebody from the inside has to come and tear it apart and say it's all garbage. And only then an insider can then claim authenticity, because if an outsider does it, it's not going to happen. Donald Trump is like the immigration official, and he says no. So a lot of Muslims are turned away from the airport, from America, from the consulates, and that kind of should send a signal. One, why is it important to go to America? Two, what are they doing wrong? So if the Muslims start becoming honest and realize that they can't have everything, they can't believe in a 1400-year-old lifestyle and expect to live in the world's greatest country, most advanced, high-tech, at least that's where they want to go. Dichotomy. This dichotomy has to be broken. where a human being feels that he can exist in two planes, one in a religious situation and one in a high-tech situation. The Germans would just call that hypocrisy. They'd be like, no, it's not possible. We only exist in one form, and it's honesty. So if you're really honest with the whole situation, then you're not going to be looking for a split personality. You're going to be looking for brutal honesty. Like, okay, science is science. The role of a creator, sure. Everybody agrees that somewhere, somehow, some power created the Big Bang and whatever the universe is. But as far as this authority intervening in matters of sexuality and human behavior and social justice, seems kind of ludicrous that he would, as a creator of heavens, would want, a female to be stoned to death or a thief's arm or hand to be cut off. And that's what Nietzsche said, that man has killed God by not God creating man in his image, but man creating God in his image with anger, jealousy, all the cheesy emotions, and kind of grafting all these emotions onto God, where when he didn't really have any of these emotions. I mean, you just have to look at a real artist. Very few artists are going to be in that kind of a mindset if you criticize their work, their art. Every day critiques, you critique somebody's art, somebody's painting, somebody's movie, somebody's book. The guy doesn't run after you with a machine gun. The Muslims have to learn that God is not expecting them to run after people with knives and swords and machine guns and kill them all, and that kind of barbarism which doesn't lead to any civilizational ascendance. It just leads to a stagnation of moral and ethical values, and promotes fear, and fear doesn't lead to any positive growth and creativity. Just look at your dog, an animal, a pet. When you try to train it, if you instill fear or if you beat it, it's not going to really learn to the best of its ability. A pet needs freedom and love, and it will come back to you and try to behave to please you in its own way rather than fearing your wrath. And that's a higher way of treating people, which the Muslims in their harsh Arabian Peninsula, the harsh climate over there, the harsh tribal discipline has led to grafting these values onto religion and enforcing it down people's throats, and it only leads to death and destruction. Moving away from this point, Donald Trump might just be causing an upheaval, kind of a mind change. I mean, we've all grown up through the 90s and the 2000s, growing up with multiculti, and we're all equal, and you must respect everybody's religions. And it wasn't the case when Protestantism was formed by Martin Luther. You had to criticize it. You had to pick it apart. You had to find points. And we still respect Martin Luther in the 15th century for having done that, or the 16th century. But the point being that we're all too tolerant of mediocrity, and that's where the philosophers of Nietzsche, Anton Chekhov, and Blavatsky, and their ilk come in, that they didn't take mediocrity lying down. I mean, the Muslims are very happy in a mediocre life. They're content, and they would trade a mediocre life for heaven at the blink of an eye. But the Europeans, upon realizing that all these concepts of heaven and hell are bullshit, and the real life is here on earth, so the sensuality, the sensuous existence, rather than the super sensuous, rather than the super sensuality promised by God, Nietzsche said, we must focus, like the Greeks, on the sensuous world, which is right here, right now. And the Greeks were masters of this in democracy and, mapping out the world with Ptolemy's map and the Hippocratic Oath, which comes from the father of medicine, I don't even know, 5,000 years ago, BC. And, the Greeks were so far ahead, and then suddenly came religion, Christianity, bam, all exegesis, all thinking, all translations were banned by the church, sort of an Islamic situation that we face today. The Jews, historically being minorities and being destroyed by the Babylonians and the Romans, realized that discretion is the better part of valor, especially with their low birth rates and small sizes. So having the same kind, being the parent form, the parent of Christianity and Islam, but the Jews prefer to keep their head down, and they would have liked to enforce halakha. You do get a lot of ultra-Orthodox trying to enforce all that now in Israel, and it's turning into a nightmarish society also, kind of a Taliban country, and you're kind of powerless to stop it, because even the Jews didn't have a reformation like the Muslims, and if the fanatics and the radicals grow in number and power, as we see Arabia swamped in, and even Israel swamped by the right-wing forces, it's all going to lead to the Talibanization of the area. And Donald Trump is completely right, in my opinion, in that way, that these right-wing forces are growing. They're not decreasing, and they're all headed for a kind of an Armageddon showdown. They're all itching for it. And Donald Trump is a realist. He's like, I build buildings, I got Trump towers everywhere. I'm not in it to destroy things. I'm here to build. And these kind of people that are not interested in a rosy future of the planet, but rather are looking for the ultimate showdown, And Donald Trump is his priority, if he becomes president, and I think he might, is to protect America. And it's a radical idea, but as Ben Carson said, as a doctor, as a surgeon, you sometimes need to make radical cuts. And it might save the day. It might save the patient. And maybe this is not the solution by banning all Muslims, but at least in getting the Muslims to think about what the hell they're doing on this planet. All of Asia is plagued by Islamic terrorism. Europe is seeing flashes of terrorist strikes. America has seen a minor terrorist strike, but they're not going to sit around waiting for a big one again since 9/11. So I think, yes, people of Europe and the United States being more of the proactive, take control situation will not stand for it. And I don't blame them. Nobody should sit around and wait for things to happen. I think seize the day, carpe diem, or carpe noctem, but seize the situation, mold it, change it to your liking. Most of the Muslims in Asia and Africa are very passive. They watch the 10% radicals, but they can't do anything about them because they feel that they're not completely Sharia compliant themselves and thus have no voice. There is no Martin Luther standing up and saying the emperor has no clothes. There is nobody of that caliber being produced in Asia and Africa. I think it's part of a global pattern. It's just not a religious pattern. We see that in science, physics, chemistry, Nobel Prizes, and nothing is happening in Asia and Africa except, by the aid of Western science or the said scientists being taken to the United States or Europe, and maybe over there he can play an important role. But as far as taking the initiative in Asia and Africa, forget about it. It hasn't happened in the last 5,000 years, and we're not probably going to see it. It's just one of those karmic things. You can keep blaming the white man's colonialism, imperialism, all the victims of Asia and Africa, of the white man, the slavery. You still have the black people crying victim in America. Black Lives Matter. Guess what? All the thugs happen to be African American in all the jails. It's not a coincidence that the police have to use force to take them down. And it's not going to stop. All these social problems of the United States are because of a heterogeneous society. Getting African Americans, at the same standard as European Americans is very difficult. It's like trying to cook them together and hope that they taste the same. But it's not going to happen. And this has been the story for 5,000 years. You just have to examine things retrospectively and look at the last great civilization of Africa. You'd be hard-pressed to find it. And that's the tragedy that Watson and Crick, when they established their DNA model, Watson had his Nobel Prize taken away because he also added to the DNA strands an addendum that he felt that the black DNA was not equal to the white DNA. And he said there were too many protein differences, and he felt that they would never catch up, no matter how much you educated them. The establishment took away his prize, and for right or wrong, but he was the father of DNA. And you can believe it, you can ignore it, but the facts are facts, and that's what we see on the ground. What are you really going to do about it? And that's where Donald Trump comes in. He's confident. He's not looking to be politically correct. He's not trying to be your best friend ever. He's talking about organic issues that face America. He's not afraid to say these things. He says, look, I don't need your money. I don't need anybody's thing. And guess what? When we leave our homes, our parents' homes, one of the things is that we want to be independent. Financially independent is the biggie. And it goes the same for the politician, that when you're free, when you're totally free of any control, you can say whatever you want. And most of our politicians can't say that because it's all about the money. I mean, they can have this kind of a personality or that kind of a personality, but at the end of the day, it's all about the money. So let's just be honest about it, you know. And Donald Trump is the only guy, I think, in the last 50 years who's not being financed by a PAC committee, a public action committee, a so-called public action committee, but mostly made up of wealthy Zionist donors who have an agenda. And that's why we see all these conspiracy theories. So I'm tired of all these conspiracy theories, and let's give it a rest. I mean, let Donald Trump come to power without taking anybody else's money, without being beholden to anyone else. And I think that he could dig it all up, find out if there are really any aliens, if 9/11 was a hoax, or what really happened to JFK. And you know, he could really sort out these issues and tell us what's really going on. But I have a feeling that there's not much to reveal. The CIA and Perm Index and all those crazy conspiracy theories that I myself used to believe in are simply not true. And we are going to see well, I mean, conspiracy theories really never get resolved. That's another thing about them, that you can talk about them for till the end of time. You know, the House of Saud, the Saudis are, you know, Jews is another conspiracy theory. Sure, they're Jews, they're Semites, you know. And Semites are relatives of each other. I mean, you know, they are people from the same region. The Afghans are known as a lost Jewish tribe. Sure they are. They are Semites. They're part of the Semitic race. And they go all the way into Punjab, you know, into the Punjab of India. They have all these hook-nosed characters who are partly Sikh, partly Muslim, and to the Kashmir Valley. And the Kashmir Valley is full of these Semites too, these curly-haired guys with pointed noses. And a lot of the Jews go over there and say, guess what? You guys are the lost tribe of Israel. And it's not too far-fetched. They are Semitic. And part of the thing is that most of the human race has forgotten about all their subspecies, you know, subtypes of humans that live here ever since Hitler gave the Aryan race a bad name. But does that mean the Aryan race doesn't exist, or the Semitic or the anti-Semitic as we know it doesn't exist? Sure they do. The Semite exists as much as the Aryan, you know. And we have the Oriental races, the Chinese, and then we have the African races. So we've got 4 or 5 major subtypes in the human family. And I mean, we all celebrate diversity. I think we should all celebrate the 5 different races that we have in the human family, the subspecies. The problem is that we try to ignore all these differences that we have amongst us and try to put everybody together in the boiler room and expect that everything's going to be the same and you're going to get a multi-culti, liberal, happy world at the end of it. And as we see, it's failed miserably. It's primarily what we call and define the Aryan race coming from, you know, Iran. You know, the swastika and all these stories associated with it from Atlantis. if we really begin to examine them, the Indo-European, or formerly they used to be known as the Indo-Aryan languages, you pretty much find out where the real cultures lie, and you find out how close Arabic is to Hebrew, and you find out the Semitic races speak Semitic languages. And big shocker, and you find that in the region of Arabia, you've got the northern Semitic, the southern, the eastern, and the western Semitic languages. And there's a whole family of them that you would never hear about because you're not allowed to discuss the Semitic or the Aryan race. And this is one of the paradoxes that we find ourselves in. Most of the Jews and Muslims that we have today are of the Semitic variety. The Arabs being Semites, also the Afghans being Semites, Iraqis, and most of the Syrians are all Semites. And you find that religion is kind of more important to these Semitic races versus Aryan races. Aryan races going from Persia onwards. I mean, Iran does seem to be under the grip of the mullahs and the Islamic zealots, the Ayatollahs, but most of the Iranian nation is pretty much anti-Islamic. As the experience I've had with a lot of the Iranian community in America has been that they're especially irreligious, non-religious, and kind of hate the mullahs of Iran more than anybody else on this planet, but they're just too weak. Again, being Asians, they're very passive. They're not able to take action. The difference that we see in Europe, where historically people have taken action and a lot of bloodshed, but they have improved their situation to a point where they're comfortable. And we see the Arab immigration coming into Europe. You have a Semitic race coming in, a highly religious race, or very attached to their religion coming into Europe, full of Aryans who are not so attached to their religion anymore, have given it up, thrown it down the toilet, while the Muslims come in with a very tyrannical form of government that they'd like to see in the form of Sharia law. And that is the logical conclusion of Sharia law. Back in the day of the Prophet Muhammad, it was Darul Islam and Darul Harb. Darul Islam would be the House of Islam, which in today's world would translate to most of Asia, versus Darul Harb is the land of war. Guess what? Any country that's not Islamic is considered under Sharia as fair game. America and Europe, South America would fall in that category of Darul Harb, is land of war, to take them over as potential kafirs, and what needs to be done to be for these continents to be brought under Sharia law. That is the actual meaning of the House of Islam, and most people are unaware of it because they don't know Arabic or don't know the roots of the religion too deeply, or it's just common sense. I mean, all religions want to spread. All Christianity was about expansion and war through the sword. The path of Christianity was littered with blood. The Islamic Empire was littered with blood. I mean, they killed, Ali, Hussein, and Hassan, and beheaded them in the mosques and wherever they could find them. It was very, very bloody. So both Christianity and Islam have had intense amount of bloodshed associated with them since their inception. The Shiites and the Sunnis have been fighting since the 8th century. It's not a recent phenomena of Sunnis blowing up Shiites or the Shiites blowing up the Sunnis. And it was like that in Europe and the Roman Empire once they became the Holy Roman Empire. And, there were a lot of witch burnings and executions, and it was a terrible time. And even after the Reformation, it was a terrible time. Henry VIII and fighting the French, the 30-Year War, and I don't know how many millions died on the altar of the cross, and how many millions are dying today on the altar of the crescent. And most rational people should be able to see that it's all bullshit, but the problem is that culture is so strong in Asia and Africa. Their parents, their grandparents, the expectations, and the honor, the family honor, and I'd just say the Semitic genes are so strong. I mean, the Jews never gave up their religion or kosher food. Even after Hitler and all the warnings from the European Aryans about separation, and Martin Luther himself writing his seminal book, The Jews and Their Lies. And how many of you have heard of that book? I mean, if you Google Martin Luther, you're going to find that book, The Jews and Their Lies, and where he calls for the Holocaust, basically. So Hitler didn't do anything out of the blue. It was like something unexpected. It was just how the civilization was leading up to a rejection of the Middle Eastern God. You could call him Yahweh, you could call him Allah. Basically, the European Aryan races were like, okay, Allah and Yahweh, you guys have got to leave. Go back to the Middle East. We're going to deport you. And that was Martin Luther talking about the Middle Eastern religions. And Hitler basically carried it out to its logical conclusion. There was no major surprise for any history student who followed the diet of the worms and who followed Luther's journey and writings and sermons, Erasmus's writings. So all these come as blinding shocks to people who have no idea of history. Now, what Donald Trump says is very American. It's an American organic reaction of a patriot. I mean, except for Donald Trump, there are no patriots in America. Everybody's looking in a way to get elected. Okay, the Hispanic vote, the Latino vote, or the black vote, the female vote, the Muslim vote, the Jewish vote. It's all ridiculous. Donald Trump is a guy who isn't a patriot. I would say out of all those 10 contenders, Donald Trump is the authentic, true American with American values of capitalism and a love for the country, to see it in a nice situation and to protect it. Not in a weak way, but in a manifesting will, in a Nietzschean way. So I would say yes, Western civilization with its tryst with Nietzsche is considered dangerous, but I would also say that mediocrity is even more dangerous. Living mediocre lives is not going to get us anywhere. If it hadn't been for Hitler and the Nazis, we wouldn't have the internet, we wouldn't have space travel, we wouldn't have rockets and jets. So technology comes at a price. I mean, you have to assert yourself. Mediocrity is not a way out, is not an excuse to exist, coexist. Let's give everybody equal rights. The lesbian, gay, transgender movement, Black Lives Movement, the feminist movement, the immigrants movement. It's not going to help us go in a positive direction. You're breaking up the momentum of especially the European people and the American people when they're engaged in trying to build into a skyscraper of into space. It's not going to happen if these people are interrupted in their growth by civil liberties, which are important, but as we see in America and Europe, being taken to ridiculous proportions. So I'm going to have to argue that we do have to come around to Nietzsche a little bit. Nietzsche was not alone. George Bernard Shaw, Anton Chekhov, and so many others, even Karl Marx and Lenin, and everybody was tired of mediocrity. The Marxists, the communists, and the Nazis were mirror images of each other. Both of them tried to shut down religion. Of course, Marxism was much more lethal to the church. Millions were executed. Millions of Christians were executed by the Marxists, by the NKVD, because they didn't fit their Marxist agenda of becoming atheists. And it was a violent way to get rid of God in Europe. The Nazis persecuted the churches. A lot of bishops and pastors had to shut up and were sent to camps. Of course, they weren't as brutal as the communists were, but it was also a movement of socialism, giving power to the people, taking it away not just from the capitalist, the industrialist, but from God. Taking power from God and giving it to the people was one of the hallmarks of communism and Nazism. The common factor being socialism. So Marx and Lenin and Nietzsche were united that this kind of power that we've given to God, laid at his feet, however unwillingly as he might be to take this power from mankind. We have made this deity where we must sacrifice, do blood sacrifices, Abraham sacrificing his child, and the Muslims slaughtering animals every year after the Hajj, and these blood sacrifices. Nobody stops to really think what they're doing. I mean, hey, Abraham would have been a psycho, would have been locked up in jail if he tried to sacrifice his son and people got to know about it. I mean, he would definitely not be around and remembered so lovingly in today's time. And the Muslims also should realize what they're doing is blood sacrifice, and it's not God who wants it, it's their own Inca, Aztec instinct that they still have in their primitive breast to lay down a blood sacrifice. Okay, before they used to have human sacrifices, but now let's put an animal over there. but God, Allah, still gets a bunch of blood. And it's not cool anymore in the modern world. It doesn't exist, cannot be accepted, and is primarily for fanatics. Seeing an animal die in the kosher halakha or the halal Islamic way is terrible. It's writhing in pain. Do you really want anyone to suffer like that? The European way of stunning them is far superior. I mean, I'm not a hypocrite. I love meat, I love beef, I love pork, I love them all. And, I'd like to see the animal die in a humane fashion. Stun the damned guy for, God's sake. And instead of slowly cutting his neck. So these are mainstream issues that we hide under the rug of social correctness and multi-kulti, peace with everybody, let the Muslims do what they want, and it reminds me of a scene from The Devil's Advocate, with Al Pacino, and there's this African guy who's basically slaughtered a goat in his apartment, and there's blood everywhere, and the cops come in and he's arrested as a psycho. But then the lawyer, I think it's Al Pacino, gets him off because he says it's part of his Islamic tradition. He was only following Allah's commands. I mean, so what if there's blood all over his apartment and the goat's head and eyes are nailed to the wall, and it just looks bizarre, an evil cult. And people are not able to see for things for what they are. They're blinded, they're hypnotized. And people think that they can never be mesmerized. But guess what? Half of our existence on this planet is hypnotism. We're all hypnotized by something or the other. Guess what advertising is? Guess what the mullah's call to prayer is? Guess what the Christian church bells are? It's all a hypnosis to get you to do what they want. And if you're stupid, if you're sleeping, you're pretty much going to obey all their stimuli. It's only when you awaken that you see through all the bullshit. I mean, guess what women do, Women put makeup on. Guess what the $5 to $10 billion industry, even more, is all about? All those cosmetics, all those lipsticks, and all those mascaras, billions of dollars of petrochemicals, nasty chemicals, causing global warming, climate change, are basically for women's beautification. I mean, imagine the furor if we banned petrochemicals. Guess what else we banned? All the women's cosmetics. And you think the women would stand for that? For even a day? No one would stand for that. So the tyranny of the system is that we're all hypnotizing each other. Romance, chemistry, it's all hypnosis. You want to be in love, your body, your receptors are ready. And you wait for something that fits your receptors, and bam, that's what happens in the animal kingdom. A dog meets a bitch in heat. Guess what happens? It's all the signals, all the receptors, fertilization. It's all nature, baby. And then you get all these laws of Hammurabi, essentially, from the Middle East, from times of BC, times of the Babylonians, where you get all these laws of how we're superior and better than the animals. And basically, we've chained ourselves down in our behavior. Whereas most of the philosophers of the 17th, 18th, 19th, even Heidegger in the 20th century were basically trying to free us from all these man-made Hammurabian laws that we've put under the garb of religion, culture, ethics. They've only been trying to free us. Schopenhauer, Hegel, Schlegel, Nietzsche essentially came to the conclusion that humans must live well on this planet. Heidegger called for an intensification of existence, a life event. Your whole life is your life event, not like a Facebook life event which says, oh hi, I got married, oh I had a child. Now that's not a life event. The real meaning of a life event is your entire life. Considering your entire life as an event, the intensification, the sensuality of your life, of every single day, of putting your nose to the ground, tasting the asphalt, tasting how the raw substance can be. Every single moment of the day is the meaning of life. Very few people are able to even realize they're alive. They're just so hypnotized. They wake up in the morning, they go to work, come back, watch TV, have sex, go to a party, come on back, and basically it's the same old thing. You realize that your whole life is very similar to everybody else's, and billions are living the same lives through the same emotions. And now we have drugs, legal drugs, fluoxetine, and all them serotonin drugs, SSRIs, and they keep your serotonin levels high. And guess what? You feel good, but it's all a lie. You were supposed to do so much more in this life. And that's where Nietzsche is so disappointed with the human race, especially the European race. And he appeals to humanity that living the mediocre life is akin to death. I mean, you're better off dead than being mediocre. And the Europeans did wake up and did look at themselves, but then also blame Nietzsche for causing World War I and Hitler and World War II, because the Europeans tried to be better than each other, and that led to ego problems, and they kind of took the message in a wrong way. And thus you have the European Union, where people try to see themselves as one and not have the ego hassles and not compete against each other, at least militarily. And I agree, that's a better thing. And Europe has increased its standard of living to very high levels. I do believe it is living an excellent life. However, the focus on science and rocketeering into the deep spaces has slowed down significantly. We're still on the Daimler-Benz engine, a gasoline engine. We're still on the Rudolf diesel external combustion engine, for which VW just got its balls busted for emission problems. I mean, VW, Volkswagen, was started by Hitler. And guess how angry Hitler would have been to find out that this is what VW is doing in the 21st century. Hello, it was supposed to be the grand future, a grand destiny, not to have VW lying and fudging up numbers to survive, to make a profit. I mean, I don't know what he would have done with the VW leadership. Sent them to Dachau, Auschwitz, or sent them to an SS firing squad and shoot the bastards. But, it's a crazy world that we live in, that when you're nice to people, people don't perform. I think humans, their psychology is built in a way that unless you kick their ass, they're not going to do anything. Whether they're Aryan or Semitic or African or, whatever. But at varying levels of performance. And it's a weird life that we have, but it's just one life. And as all the philosophers said, we're all experiments. George Bernard Shaw and others of his time, his cohorts, all agree that life is an experiment. It's experimental, this existence. Every day must be another experiment. We must seize the life. We must make sure that we are experimenting with as many permutations and combinations in a day as possible to actually be alive and worthy of life. Otherwise, it's pointless mediocrity. Happiness, as George Bernard Shaw again said, is being miserable. I mean, if you have nothing to do and you're happy, man, that's the worst thing ever he could imagine. He said happiness is a pathetic luxury only for animals. For human production, labors, work. And one of the signs that the Germans had was Arbeit macht frei, which has been given a terrible name for hanging outside Auschwitz. But if you really examine the metaphysical connotations, it didn't just pop out in thin air for the Jews. It was mostly for the human race that work will set you free. And a lot of the 17th, 18th, 19th century philosophers of England and Russia, Anton Chekhov, and they were all for work will set you free kind of a lifestyle in a proper way. Find your passion, do your work in that direction. Where is your passion? Life without passion is just not worth living. And on that note of passion, every philosopher you know is going to agree with that one word, passion. Because without passion, existence is futile, it's pointless, it's like a Drosophila fly. So, as I close this talk, I would only say, find your passion. And what religions do, including Islam, Christianity, Judaism, is try to curb your passion, try to harness it while keeping you down. And once you set yourself free, your passion is what's going to take you to becoming a Superman instead of living the mediocre life.